You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. It is Friday, June 7th, 2024. I am Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell, and this is The Outcue. Last week, we sat here and discussed the immediate aftermath of major breaking news. At the time, we were just 3 days after the explosion at the Chase Bank in the Realty building in downtown Youngstown. And so we sat here and we discussed how you jump into action when something big happens suddenly. So this week, what we're getting into is what follows from that. So there is a point where the adrenaline fades, the thoughts become clearer, and there's a lot we still don't know after the initial dust settles after major breaking news. So with us today to discuss how we move from the up here, all guns blazing mode to, okay, what do we still need to know? What aren't they telling us? What do we need to push for? And how do we serve the public moving forward? Is Madison Tromler and Chris Sarinelli, who have both been working on this particular story and have worked on the aftermath of many major breaking news stories. So I want to start there, and either one of you can jump in. After you cover something huge, there's the immediate part where it's like, okay, we got to get this angle and this angle and this angle, and we got to talk to the people that are affected and find out what we know about what happened and who's investigating. But then there's this moment where we go, okay, we know as much as we can know that day. What don't we know? So reflect on that and where it moves from there.
Yeah. So I think when the breaking news situation happens, we're reporting, obviously in those initial moments, exactly what officials are telling us, what the fire chief, what the mayor, in this instance, we were hearing from the fire chief and Mayor Tito Brown about what had happened. And so we're, reporting, okay, natural gas leak is what they're saying, and how it's going to unfold in the days to come on what they know so far. And I think as the days follow, things change. So not saying anything necessarily, changed in that instant, but as days go on, some of the initial immediate findings might not be the same as maybe weeks later as the investigation continues. So you have to follow up and continue to ask them, has this specific thing changed at all since the first day that they said this? Because I think sometimes things are initially all laid out and reported, and then over time, maybe a month later when for example, the NTSB preliminary report comes out, we may find things are different, so it's important to keep following it.
Sure. The initial becomes clear, but what also becomes clear is what we still don't know, right?
Right.
I think about East Palestine, and when you're in the midst of a breaking news situation, the first day or two or hour or two, whatever the case may be, I think, personally, you're already thinking ahead. You have to handle the situation right now. You have to, kind of feed the beast, so to speak, but you're already thinking ahead, days and weeks in advance. And I think there's a lot of pressure that's there because people want answers right away, and you're not necessarily able to give them to them for whatever reason. The information's just not there, or the investigation's just not done. I think we want to fulfill that, but there are a lot of circumstances where we just can't.
And there's also in the immediate, that when something first happens, it's a lot of what we call sort of nuts and bolts reporting. There's just, this is what happened today. Following that become those bigger questions. For instance, in East Palestine, I recall that the day afterwards, that noon news conference on that Saturday, I remember that Janet Rogers had a lot of questions about the specific chemical compounds. She had clearly spent time researching everything that they could do and might be capable of doing. She had spoken to experts and was thinking ahead, of course, on what the public health implications may be, even as everybody else in the room was just asking about, the temperature of the cars that day. And I remember being very impressed, honestly, to listen to that, because the preparation that went into it, but also it was laying the groundwork for the things that we still are asking about to this day and will ask about forever. Yeah. And with the Realty building, again, the information you mentioned coming from the mayor, coming from the fire chief, coming from the police chief, and they're telling you what they know right then. So there's more reliance on the public officials in the immediate telling, but afterwards we have to take not a negative eye towards them, but our eye does have to become more skeptical.
Skeptical, right?
As we figure out what we don't know.
Yeah, and I feel like, to your point, when when breaking news happens, you have to let people know what's going on. Like people who, this affects their life. Like this is what's going to happen tomorrow. For example, the structural engineers coming today, we're reporting that and we're letting people know here's what's happening. But, as time goes on, I think then you start to take a look at, okay, and not, I'm not alleging that anything's not being done properly, but you're looking at a situation and asking yourself, like, is this the usual process for how something's followed? Like, how does this normally go? How is the normal ordinances? What does Ohio law say about this? And those aren't things that necessarily people are going to need to know in that moment because they need vital information, but and it wouldn't be something that we could investigate within a day or something like that. But over time, you're able to take a look back and kind of see how things played out, and if the transparency side of it and things like that, I think is really important after breaking news. Well,
sure, you can't trust anybody without verification. That's all.
And yeah, being thorough in the process of getting the information right, and this business is all about what have you done for me lately? And we had an opportunity on Wednesday to try to advance the story any way we can. You have the report that you're assigned that day, the story that you're working on that day, and that's all you have that day. But it's what do you do with it? So Wednesday, we were looking for an opportunity to advance the story, get some of these questions answered. And we got a couple of them, at least with the fire chief on Wednesday when I was reporting at council, but there were still some punting that was going on, and still some questions that we had to really press hard on.
And that has continued. I mean, I speaking specifically of the Realty building, the questions that really arose this week were, and you're just looking for, I'll say red flags, but they may not be red flags. They may just be a mishandling of communication strategy on someone's part. But we discovered that the work that was being done in the basement of that building at the time of the explosion was ordered by the city, and the city had awarded the contract without any bids to the building's owner and allocated over $140,000 for that work to be done. Now, there is nothing wrong with that, to be abundantly clear. There are any number of reasons that may be, but it was odd, or at least bad communication, that the city didn't mention that on Tuesday night, on Wednesday morning, that it had to be uncovered. So it begs questions. Why weren't there any bids? And why was the contract given to the building's owner? And were those people properly vetted? And the big one I had that we finally did get an answer to, and this is when you mentioned what the fire chief said, is normally a determination on whether a building gets torn down on an emergency basis is a decision made by the fire chief. The city was saying that decision would be made by the building's owner. We just wanted to know why this was a deviation in the normal process. Right. Well, finally they've answered that it's because the NTSB is here, they have to conduct their investigation, and of course we'd be up in arms, and rightfully so, if the city ordered all the evidence destroyed, right?
Right.
But why couldn't they have said that on the front end? So you've got to be skeptical.
Right. And those are good examples of how you can look back and say, during the NTSB press conference, they were saying, a third party company, third party workers. And immediately, I was wondering who are the third party workers? And that's why it goes to show the value of looking at meeting agendas and stuff, and looking at past, because then you can kind of have a better understanding, I think, when those kinds of situation happens, is maybe we would have, I wouldn't say we would have known by just seeing that line, and obviously it's hard to catch something, you have no idea, but just by reading that allowed us to figure that out, so that's pretty interesting.
And also, where did the money come from? That's a question we were trying to figure out, is, which portion of the funds, the city's coffers did this money come from?
Yes, and that's still an unanswered question, because, and this is another one of those, the city might not like that we're going to be aggressive on these questions, but we have to, because it was allocated on a border control agenda to come from something called a build grant, which is a federal grant that by law has to go out for competitive bidding. City has acknowledged that this was not bid. So why? Well, now the city's saying, you know what, I don't know why it was written that way, but that's not the funding that we were going to use, and we haven't actually paid them yet.
Right.
So
we have not been invoiced, is what Kyle
Right.
Myasek told me.
So that's fine, but that's not a minor mistake. If you write up and approve in a public meeting how money's being allocated, you can't just be wrong about that. That has to be rectified, and it does. We wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't ask that question. Either way, it's tax money. The question is whether or not it's your money from the feds or your money at the local level, but one way or the other, they paid for this out of your money. We have every right to know why and how it got paid for. And none of this is casting aspersions. I don't know. I have no reason to think that anybody doing the work in that basement wasn't qualified. But I have every right to ask if they were.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, after seeing that this did, in a sense, stem from the city mandating green card companies, according to their meeting agenda, to hire someone to do this work so that it wouldn't affect the Smart 2 project. As soon as we saw that, and we have the community, the public asking exactly like what happened and how, it's just our job to say, oh, okay, so like the city had some involvement of trying to get some sort of work done, having to do with utility lines in the basement, and so it's our job to ask about that because people want to know exactly what potentially led up to it and what was going on there. So I think when we saw that, it is kind of interesting that we didn't hear about that from the city initially, but it is an investigation, and they're treating the situation obviously differently, just like they didn't have the fire chief do the emergency able to call an emergency demolition like they normally can. It is obviously a different situation, so they're being careful, and I mean haven't really dealt with something like this and ever potentially. So,
but the message there that I would have is then just that they need to be careful in their communication strategy. That doesn't mean refuse to answer questions. It just means be prepared for the questions so you answer them in a legally sound way.
And it's part of the accountability thing. People, you talked about, people think that we're part of the, we're kind of in cahoots with, the powers that be. When it comes to accountability, I don't feel like, and I'm going to try to say this diplomatically, but I just don't think people are aware enough of the role of journalism in a democracy and the basic functions it's supposed to serve. We are the vehicle of accountability and speaking truth to power, and this is exactly what we're trying to do. So I think if people knew that and would listen to conversations like these, get an idea of quote unquote how the sausage is made, so to speak, it might not change your mind, but at least give you some perspective on this that that maybe you didn't have before.
And that's why we sit here every week and do this, because I want everybody to, and I hope people watch these in their totality and they watch all the different topics we talk about, because I do want people to understand how the sausage is made. We had a council member after this week's news conference come up to our reporter, and I don't need to be that diplomatic. It was Councilman Julius Oliver came up to our reporter and said that something to the effect of not wanting to know why we ask the types of questions that we ask. We're kicking the city while they're struggling, while they're in a tough position. That couldn't be further from the truth in terms of our motivation. I don't think anybody in the city has done anything wrong here. It's simply that there are unanswered questions, and you do get suspicious in this line of work whenever anybody refuses to answer a question or gets seemingly unnecessarily defensive about it. If you can't answer something, explain to me why you can't answer it, and I can assess that answer. But don't tell me I shouldn't be asking the question, because that makes me think you're deflecting, and I want to know why.
Right.
That just makes it worse.
Right.
I mean, honestly.
And that's true. I mean, that's been true in many other situations. I can talk about a major breaking news situation from years ago. Might have been before either of you were here. Were either of you here when Robert Seaman jumped from the 4th floor over at the courthouse?
It's like a year before I got here.
So for anybody who doesn't remember, because obviously time blends and it feels not long ago at all to me, but it was many years ago now, This was a murder defendant. He was accused of rape and murder of his girlfriend's daughter and her grandparents. He had lit the house on fire. I guess I still say allegedly because he was never convicted, but he was heading for trial. And he had been accused of rape, and when he was going to go to trial for the rape, this house burns down. It's ruled to be an arson. He's charged with their murder. And right before it was to go to trial, he, after a hearing, leapt from the 4th floor balcony in the courthouse to his death. And it was a major, major breaking news story. There was a lot of eyes on this trial. A lot of people were following it, and nothing like that anybody could recall in recent memory having happened. And it was, I'll never forget that morning walking over there with a morning show anchor, unsure if the tip we had gotten was true, and seeing this body lying under a sheet in the courthouse rotunda, and everybody standing around kind of in a daze. So, major breaking news. What happened? How did it happen? But the next day, or might have even been later that day, we had a simple question, which is, do security protocols need to be revised or looked at? Because as he was led away from the courthouse, he was able to just take a running start and make this leap because he wasn't really restrained in any way.
Right.
Again, nothing accusatory, but this is that next step. Like, geez, are we just lucky this kind of thing doesn't happen more often? And what if he would have taken someone with him? And what are, we need to really think about whether or not we got to think about things here. And the reaction from the sheriff's department was very, very defensive that we'd be asking that. And I think it was a misunderstanding. They simply thought that we were accusing them of dropping the ball. We weren't. None of us saw this coming. But now that it's happened, do we need to look at this? That's just looking ahead at the next step. What can we learn from this? I think that's what I'm getting at with that story, is all breaking news ultimately has lessons. And what are the lessons we can learn? And that's what we spend weeks or sometimes years chasing afterwards.
And that comes back to what I was saying. There's nothing inherently accusatory in asking the questions. It's what a journalist is supposed to do. You're supposed to cover all the bases. You're supposed to be thinking of these kinds of things because the person watching or listening or reading at home is thinking of them, so we need to be thinking of them too.
Yeah, it's like the natural curiosity that everyone has, when they're at
The human condition.
Yeah, someone who hears, okay, the Smart 2 project, for example, bringing it back to the Realty Tower, naturally someone might say, oh, like, why did the city pay that company? Just curious. Why did they,
Right.
that's all this is. And that's what reporting is. It's really just asking the questions that, constituents obviously deserve to have the answers to. They vote these people into office.
You guys familiar with the term surrogate citizen? It's one of my favorite ways to describe what a journalist is. And I know that the average viewer will never have heard of this, but I remember it from college. And the term, it basically is this. The average person, they go do a job that is not our job. They go, whatever their job is. They've got to work. They might have kids. They might have, I don't know, sporting events to get to, or second jobs, or hobbies, or whatever. They have a life to lead is the point. They're busy. They're very busy. So they have access to everything we have access to. What they don't have is the time to think about these things and figure out what to look for and dig through it and go to the meetings and request the documents. They can. Every citizen can do what we do. We have no special protections. So our role essentially is to act as the surrogate citizen, to think about all the things they need to know that they'd probably think of on their own if they had the time, and they may be thinking of on their own but don't have the time.
I want to make a little bit of a more personal appeal to build off of that. You talked about the, officials ask all the time, why are you trying to make us look bad? Why are you trying to hurt us while we're down? And, they say stuff like that. In your case, you're from Northeast Ohio in general, but Justin, you and I are from here, born and raised here. I eat at the restaurants downtown. We have kids and relatives in the same schools that everyone else does. We pay the same taxes you do. We live in this community. We care about it. We're from here. Why would we do that? Why would we, come on.
Yes, absolutely.
Think about that.
No, that's a great point. We ultimately, we are all of a piece that we want to raise this community up.
Right.
Getting these questions answered helps do that. And there are sometimes cases where the answers to those questions are things that certain people are hiding, and I'm certainly not speaking of necessarily of any of the cases that we're talking about right now. But there are times where they are hiding something. And you know what? Then, if you are hiding something from the people, then I am out to get you, because you are the one that is doing something to hurt this community. And I want that exposed because the citizens deserve better.
Truth to
Right.
power.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's
Right,
it.
right.
That's
Yeah,
what
and
it
the
all
only
boils
way,
down to.
And the only way to make a real difference, because sometimes, we do think about like, okay, what's the impact of doing this story or asking these questions? But at the end of the day, like, to make a real impact and to make real change, and for people to make decisions about their lives, they do need to know who they're voting for, and they do need to know the issues in their community. And maybe there'll be immediate effects from that, whatever it is, but long term, like, that can only help for people to be more aware.
Exactly.
You becoming uncomfortable by something you see or that's presented in journalism, that's on you. That's not on journalists. It's what you do with the information. So just as we have a responsibility to be ethical and to get the details right and to be fair and all those things, the viewer, the listener, the reader, the consumer has a responsibility of what to do with the information.
Exactly. That's it. We're providing that service. We ultimately we work for the people, and the public officials work for the people also. But if we're not watching them, then we wouldn't be looking out for the people. And if there's nothing to find, then we're just reinforcing the good work that they do. And many of them do very, very good work.
And we love doing good stories. I mean, people
Yes.
think,
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
the featurey stuff and the good stuff, the feel-good stuff, give us more of that.
Of
That's
course,
great.
Yeah, and it's about context, like providing context about your community.
Yeah.
Like obviously there's, things that the officials say, press releases, and then there's people, and then we're kind of in the gray area to where we're able to dissect all of this information and using public records requests and taking time doing it for a living to then provide actual context to all the things going on.
So as I wrap these up, I always come up with a question that may put you on the spot and you won't have an answer right away for. And if you don't stammer or stumble too much with it. But we talked about there's always lessons to be learned from breaking news. What's a major lesson that you've learned from something that was originally a breaking news story that you can think of?
I have to think for a second.
Just awareness. I think, kind of what I was saying in the beginning, you're aware of what's going on. You have a lot to present in that moment and sort things out in that moment. But, just be present and aware, not just of what's around you, but what's going to be coming, and be proactive in your coverage. I think is a big one.
For me, I can say that it's not even necessarily a big, broad brush lesson, as just things that I wouldn't have known. For instance, the NTSB is studying or investigating this explosion this week. Had East Palestine never happened, I wouldn't know anything about the way the NTSB works. I know a lot now about what to expect and when to expect it and how much detail there will be and what to look for because of East Palestine. So
Yeah.
that would be something I've learned.
Sure.
I'm a sharper journalist for that, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like the NTSB, it's not like a familiar agency. We didn't even know they were going to be investigating the Realty Tower. I at least didn't, and then
I
we
didn't
realized
either.
that it's transportation because it's natural gas in the pipeline, but like still. So mine, I would say, I think mine actually is. I just think from the real and East Palestine, of course, but really listening to what people are saying that were there, or like really do talking to everyone who witnessed it. And obviously you take everything with a grain of salt. When we talk with someone who witnessed, or his wife was there, anything, etc., that doesn't mean it gets reported. But I think when you do have those initial witness accounts, that really is very valuable just to help us understand, and I think in those moments we're trying to ask the mayor and all these officials that were not
Yes.
there,
No, that's a good point. I think what you're getting at is that there are things, even now, there are things that we have heard or people we've spoken to in the past week or two that have had accounts of things that have not made the news. They're not really relevant yet, but they could become relevant. So if you're listening in the moment, you're remembering that there's little threads to pull everywhere for where to ask the next question when it poses itself.
Right, right.
Agreed.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So it's all about listening to people is really all. No, that's what a lot of what we do is about. We listen more than we talk. I know that
Talk a lot, but
watching this, right? Is,
No,
but
listening.
we talk a lot while we're coming up with what we need to ask, and then we ask and we listen actively so that we can ask the next question. You know, it's not all preordained.
Yep.
It's an active process. And with that, I would, as always, remind everybody that if you have anything you'd like us to look into, anything you think we need to know about, anything you think that the community needs to know about, you can always, or if you see breaking news happening, you can always contact us at 330-744-8821, news@wfmj.com, watchdog@wfmj.com. You can also send us messages on Facebook and on Twitter, although I would prefer you don't. I would prefer you do the email or the phone call.
Yeah.
I do check the Facebook Messenger, but it's a lot of places to look, and the email is the best.
Yeah.
And with that said, we will be back next week as always, and this has been the Outcue.